I'm David Bank, and from Impact Alpha, this is an Agents of Impact podcast.
But if you just do that on the back of largely bankrupt institutions or institutions that are quite corrupt or just quite broken and just dysfunctional, you sort of will guarantee nothing other than either a new oligarchy or, an old oligarchy in new clothing.
That's Todd Khozein of SecondMuse, an impact ecosystem builder and investor that designs and deploys innovative financing for a resilient, inclusive, and sustainable economy. Todd's family fled Iran in 1979 with other Baha'i families who were persecuted after the Islamic Revolution. In a recent post on Impact Alpha, he applied SecondMuse's system thinking to the provocative topic of the 21st century reconstruction of Iran, whether that comes in 5 months or 5 years. In our conversation, Todd talked about the relational imperative, women's participation, the Iranian diaspora, and the role of impact investors. Huge capital investments alone won't be enough to build a new and resilient Iran without deep and meaningful trust building. I think you'll enjoy our conversation. Todd Khozein, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, David. So wonderful to be here with you.
Todd, you and SecondMuse have been such great partners over the years in particularly helping us think about ecosystems. I know clean tech in New York State that you've worked on, youth mental health with Headstream, plastics recycling in Southeast Asia, always with a kind of whole ecosystem lens that we find super valuable and helpful. So thank you for that. And you also contributed a terrific piece that we ran a couple months ago on the situation in Iran and the rebuilding of Iran. And you are Iranian, so just start us there.
Yeah, I was born in Iran in a Baha'i family, which ended up being one of the significant persecuted classes during the Islamic Revolution. So I fled under pretty severe persecution, which involved losing some family in the process. Landed in Latin America, which is where I grew up.
In Ecuador.
In Ecuador, yeah, Ecuador. I lived for 10 years in Quito. And then eventually kind of moved my way up north to the U.S. and then Canada, then back into the U.S. But so even though my day job is really building economies, for good, and really sort of challenging what I call the long con that, economic growth needs to come at the expense of human dignity of entire swaths of the human family or the environment. That's kind of been my professional life. But in the background has always been this question of Iran and the situation that sort of that country has found itself in for the last 47 years, which certainly caused myself, but many other families to flee the country. And so this kind of prompted a paper, which was partially an act of therapy, I think, but partially just, it was close to home, especially given the economic undertones of currently what's happening in Iran.
Just reflect a little bit on how it's been watching the last few months for you at a personal level. I don't want the political punditry, but just watching this all unfold, it's kind of the opposite of the kind of ecosystems I think you've been trying to build all your life.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's been agonizing. I've had, over a dozen family members that have, either been shot, imprisoned. A couple are actually imminently facing execution. I mean, it's somewhat hard to explain for somebody that has not sort of lived in this situation. But, the bombs keep them up at night, and their own government keeps them awake during the day. And so there's this constant ongoing stress for our families and our friends in there, and outside of the time when the internet is not cut off, and of course the communication has been a bit hit or miss. But it's tough. It's really tough just having that uncertainty and really feeling very helpless in a sense. There's only so much you can do when you're all the way across the world, and even communication is a bit of a stretch. So it's been heavy. It's been tough. There's moments of hope in there. I mean, it's complicated. There's moments where you think, is it going to change? And then despite all the awfulness around it, so it's complicated.
Indeed. And I was taken by a line in your piece that said, whether it's 5 months or 5 years, there will be a reconstruction of Iran, and it's maybe a little bit of a leap in the current moment to think about the possibilities for the future, but that's maybe exactly the point, which is we have to start thinking about the possibilities. So just tell us sort of what the elements of this 21st century reconstruction might be.
Yeah, I mean, you can't build a rich economy on a bankrupt society, and the bankruptcy of the current regime, both in terms of how they treat their own people as well as how they treat their neighbors, is kind of the brick wall is inevitable. But sometimes it takes a long time, sometimes it takes a short time, and so to your point, there's a lot of really good reasons why this economic collapse was inevitable and why the regime's collapse, I believe, is inevitable. But you just don't know when it's gonna come. It feels kind of like death pangs, and it might, those can last a long time, unfortunately, sometimes. But there's two kind of lenses that I take in the paper around thinking about the reconstruction, and we oftentimes think about the Marshall Plan, at the end of the Second World War for the rehabilitation of Europe, where we really think about this sort of almost top-down infusion of capital that actually wasn't actually a lot of capital. It represented about 2.5% of the annual GDP of Europe. So proportionally, the numbers that are currently being thrown around, for example, in Iran, are significantly larger than that as a proportion of GDP. But that was one, is that, hey, money's got to come in somehow from the outside to help rebuild the past. But if you just do that on the back of largely bankrupt institutions, or institutions that are quite corrupt or just quite broken and just dysfunctional, you sort of will guarantee nothing other than either a new oligarchy or an old oligarchy in new clothing. And so this really needs to be mapped with a much more bottoms up trust building approach. For a society that the governmental program has pursued, what I refer to as a plan of relational poverty, or a strategy of relational poverty, but they've really intentionally frayed the social fabric, which has allowed them to maintain their grasp on power. And that's a fabric that's going to need to be rebuilt. Otherwise, you're just never going to be able to build anything viable on top of it. And so these two processes, I believe, need to happen simultaneously. A good example of that we have, which has its own problems, is the Paz Territorial from Colombia, not too far from where I grew up, where the aftermath of a brutal civil war, there was a recognition that, hey, the unity has to happen at the village level. It has to happen from neighbors to neighbors. And if it doesn't happen at that level, whatever you bring on from the outside is going to be sitting on a rotting, shifting foundation. And so the idea being that deeply collaborative, community-based consultation and dialogue ultimately becomes effectively the architecture through which the capital will ultimately flow to rebuild the country. And so I really think that when the rebuild happens, which I believe it inevitably will, it's going to have to involve deep trust building, restoration, sort of restorative work from the bottom up. But that alone, and this was the problem of Colombia, is that a lot of times that happened and then the money was slow to flow for a bunch of different reasons. And so if you're going to say, hey, if we interact with each other in a fundamentally different way, a more hopeful way, a more kind and compassionate way, a more unified way, it's going to be better for all of us. That's the promise. So that promise has to be mapped with real capital to rebuild these institutions. But if it comes too early, then you're in a different kind of a trouble, which is that you haven't built the relational infrastructure to be able to ultimately have that capital turn into building a society and an economy and in this case a nation that would ultimately stand the test of time.
That's a design challenge kind of the first order, but let's kind of break it down a little bit. So you mentioned the kind of top-down Marshall Plan model, the maybe more bottom-up Colombia model, probably in distinction to the Venezuela model, which is a whole different thing. And there was a provision, I think, in the memorandum of understanding, the so-called truce or ceasefire that didn't last very long, that called for a kind of reconstruction fund, something to the order of $300 billion. Which model does that fall into?
I mean, honestly, neither. There's been some great retroactive analysis done on the Marshall Plan, and the net of it all is that it wasn't the amount of the money, it was the conditionality of the money, meaning this money comes with strings attached. It was granted money, but the country would have to pursue a certain plan. The only plan that was listed in this agreement was about the nuclear threat, or the nuclear program. in that case, it was about democratizing institutions, ensuring that there's actually a viable private sector. There was elements of anti-corruption. And so in this case, you're talking about entirely private sector capital, which presumably was partially capitalized according to some of the reports that had come out, and way more money, right? I mean, like, this is about 8 to 9 times greater than Marshall money in comparison with the GDP. I mean, this is almost the entire annual GDP of Iran is what the size of this is. And it came with zero trust building, community based, ground up efforts at all. And so, I mean, I think that this is kind of one of the things that you see is that the people of Iran are, truly have never had a voice, in any of this conflict, and they've been the recipients of the bullets and the recipients of the harm, but they really have not been consulted, supported, had a voice in what ultimately is a pretty brutal regime. So I think that this is actually the example of the worst of both worlds in a sense, because you're talking about return-seeking private sector capital with very little strings about the future of the society coming top down, pouring into a country of which reports are between a third or a half of the entire economy is run by the IRGC. What do you think is going to happen to that, to those dollars? A betting person would not bet that money would go into building healthy communities that are building economies for the future.
So you speak of relational poverty. I think the corollary is what you call the relational imperative. And so just play that out so we can then apply it to the Iran case.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, the work that we've been doing at SecondMuse over the last couple of decades is really premised on this idea that, I mean, at the highest level, our economic thesis is, economies that ultimately elevate humanity, that lift up humanity, that are, restorative or certainly not harmful of the environment. These are ultimately just going to be fundamentally better economies. We tend not to make the moral argument for building inclusive, sustainable economies. We make the economic argument for it, just that these are going to be the economies that are going to stand the test of time for some of the reasons that we've already discussed. And this is building off of a rich body of literature from North, Putnam, Acemoglu, Fukuyama, talking about how trust and, elements of relationship, whether at the institutional level, like inclusive institutions that Acemoglu talk about, or at the individual level, like what Fukuyama talk about, that these ultimately are hard economic metrics that weave themselves and ultimately are indicative of healthy economies. And, this work is, Acemoglu in particular won the Nobel Prize for economics a couple of years ago. And so there's a rich body of literature that does this. For SecondMuse, we've been practitioners in the field, figuring out how do you take this theory and this principle, which doesn't have that, I mean, it's pretty well accepted from an academic standpoint. How does this ultimately weave its way into the actual functioning, into the work that you're doing? So the question for us, and if you think about this, so if this is at the highest level, that these kind of economies are ultimately going to be better economies. At the lowest level, when you really think about our thesis, it ultimately boils down to healthy relationships and right relationships, because good, strong relationships leads to trust, and trust is just a highway for truth. I mean, if you think about yourself as an entrepreneur, if you're an entrepreneur and you are in an environment where you feel like people are out to get you, where you feel that you have enemies, on all sides of you, you're not going to expose your vulnerabilities. You're going to protect your vulnerabilities because you see the people around you as a threat and not an ally or an asset to help you build your business. Well, protecting my vulnerabilities doesn't make them go away. And arguably, the reason that they're vulnerabilities in the first place is because that we're awful at even seeing, let alone fixing our own vulnerabilities. There's a reason their vulnerabilities are there in the first place. So we kind of like desperately need other people to say, hey, you're not good at this. You need to do this differently or this differently or this differently. In an environment with the absence of trust, that's impossible. That just never happens. So you'll never hear truth because you're never exposing truth in a sense. Now, the reverse of that, which is the relational imperative, effectively, or when we refer to relational wealth, is if you're in an environment where you have trusting relationships with those around you, it's the opposite. You actually want to expose your vulnerabilities because you believe that everybody around you wants to help you. And so why would you not talk about your weaknesses, what you're struggling with? Because at the end of the day, these people are ultimately going to help you. Now, this experience as an individual entrepreneur aggregates at the societal level. And so this fundamental element, when we when we're doing our work, for that you referenced around building a climate economy in New York, or building a market for adolescent mental health spaces online, or trying to address the problem with plastic waste, whether we're doing the research in the earliest days, whether we're supporting entrepreneurs, everything is designed and structured around increasing relational wealth between all of the actors, between entrepreneurs and themselves in the community, between the community entrepreneurs, between entrepreneurs and the governments, between multinational corporations. Because the more of that you have, you just have more. You have more lanes to work in. You have more flexibility in arrangements. You have a more opportunity to generate and understand opportunities to be able to go for business. And so this idea of the relational imperative is ultimately we design everything fundamentally for relational wealth at its root and start building from there. Because the stronger that is, the more economic opportunity ultimately there is going to be. Which is again why we make the economic rather than the moral arguments. Because the economics are very real and they're pretty well established at this point.
I love how you say, this is not some sort of soft, afterthought to the economics. This actually is the whole economic argument. And in Iran, you say, yes, you could measure it. You could see, like, you cite, participation of women in the workforce, patents filed, overseas versus Iranians still in Iran. So therefore, some kind of proxy for the sort of innovation incentives or disincentives, as the case may be. And so how does a whole country, go about building these kinds of relationships and trust?
Yeah, I mean, this is precisely why I think that serious thought needs to go into this infrastructure before the money flows. Like, money will not solve these problems. Without the money, you won't be able to solve the problems either. But money will not solve the problems. And so the amount of time that I spent thinking through the frameworks, even just to get to the point where I had an idea that ultimately that I felt was worth writing about, was an extraordinary amount of time. And that's building on a couple decades of work, literally in the space of building, relational economies. If we don't do some really deep thinking around the mechanics of how to do it, even just security, how do you maintain security? If you have local leaders getting shot, which was one of the things that happened in Colombia, how are you building trust? There needs to be a transitional government. What does that even look like? What's the structure of that transitional government? What are the actual mechanics by which a decision-making process that then leads to a decision actually unlocks capital around there? The other complicating factor in this case is the sanctions unspooling. The level of sanctions at so many different countries and organizational levels. Some of them are multilateral, some of them are national, some of them can be written away by a president, some of them need an act of Congress or Parliament in the case of some of the European economies. So I think that the answer of how do you do it is something that's going to need a deep program of thought to think through how do we rebuild. I think that we have really legitimate good attempts that we've learned from. And I think that the Paz Territorial in Colombia is a really good one. The program in Bosnia, you see this. You also have warnings, where like the de-Baathification in Iraq, about what happens when it goes wrong as well. And so I feel like this idea of nation building, of rebuilding nations, we have some good examples that have kind of happened sometimes on the back of like a panicked, frenzied, oh my God, we need to get something together. But in this case, when you can sort of read the tea leaves that it's going on there, it feels like I identify a number of the things that I think that are going to be critical. Surely I've missed some, but each one of those I feel like it needs a proper treatment in and of itself, and really deep thinking on how do we rebuild that. And I think that the promise on the other side is if you can show how you can rebuild from so far down to something that's passable or even extraordinary, the hope that can generate about how all of us could sort of take a step forward could be quite powerful.
Well, I think in thinking big, you laid out the considerable assets, of Iran. 93 million people, very well educated, majority under 35, and sort of the possibilities of, decentralized renewable energy, an AI optimized workforce, a financial system that can leapfrog directly into the kind of, new digital, auditable, interoperable systems. I mean, it really could be a kind of role model for a kind of way to rebuild, other economies as well.
No, it really could. Just take the plight of women in Iran that you mentioned, and it's important to mention. Some of some of your listeners might be a little less familiar with the Iranian context, but this is not a there's a 14% workforce participation by women in Iran. The World Bank ranks them 31 out of 100. This is not cultural. If you look at Saudi on the same scale, they're ranked 71. The Emirates are ranked 82 out of 100. This is regionally the plight of women's economic freedom is significantly suppressed inside of Iran, and it's legally codified.
And it's a huge squandering of talent, because a lot of these women are college educated and
That's right,
and ready to contribute all kinds of things.
That's right. The majority, as a matter of fact. So it is one of the single greatest acts of economic self-sabotage that I have ever read about, where you have educated the majority of university entrants and exam takers are women. Yet 14% of them, there's a 14% label, participation in the workforce. 1.2, I believe, is the actual number out of every 10 workforce eligible women who actually participate in the workforce in Iran. So you have this artificially sidelined gold mine of talent, and in many cases, I make the leapfrogging arguments, where it's like sometimes if you don't have something, you can actually get to the future faster, because the barrier to getting to the future is not sometimes it's the presence of old infrastructure. Well, if you don't have any infrastructure, the presence of old infrastructure is no longer a barrier. And so in some cases you can leapfrog. The classic example is, cellular technology in sub-Saharan Africa, how it moved so quickly because there was no issue of getting past the trap of dated infrastructure, of legacy infrastructure. But in the case of, one of the things that companies and countries are struggling for is the path to move from non-AI workforce to AI-powered workforce. And what is that thinking? One of the biggest barriers is habits in the way that we're thinking and the way that we're working, and how do we work with new technology so that we don't lose our humanity, so that we're actually even more human than we were before, but we're empowered in a great, in a very powerful way by this new amazing technology. Gosh, you have effectively, a virgin workforce. You know what I mean? Like, you basically have a workforce that is never participated in the workforce. That all of a sudden you can have a program of workforce development, where you have this sidelined, brilliant, educated population that's just chomping at the bit, and that wants to participate in the workforce, but is legally blocked from doing so in many cases. Both implicitly, but also.
So it's leapfrogging in social infrastructure as well as in physical infrastructure. And in this case, it's talent. And you say it's sort of AI enabled and AI sort of optimized from the get-go. What does that mean in terms of, being able to take advantage now of all these new systems? What does that mean in terms of bringing Iran back into the world economy in a positive way?
Yeah, but in an incredible way. Also, in impact, and those of us that are broadly categorized as impact investors, or systemic investors, we don't think about just the upside that you can get. You also think about the elimination of the downside that it was costing you before you solved the problem. So, the recidivism is the great example of it's so expensive, but if somebody who might go back to the system, a returning citizen, ultimately can have a job and is contributing to their community and their family and also giving taxes, not only is that amazing, but it's also you're also saving on the downside of reincarceration. So you can imagine the delta between a country being an exporter of chaos to being a creator of beauty and a creator of innovation and a creator of what country in the world is really nailing it right now? Our fundamental systems of governance are really struggling to meet the needs of the age in which we speak. Look at all democratic countries, and we're whiplashing all over the place because we're desperate. I think as a citizenry, we're desperate for solutions that our government institutions are not terribly well prepared to handle. And so could we design something that feels, the founding fathers pieced out and locked themselves up and came up with something that was amazing a long time ago. Could we do the same thing to figure out, what a future could look like? Well, I think that that's not only inspiring for the nation in which it's happening, but it's inspiring for the world that can think, oh, maybe we can think differently about how we govern ourselves as a society, how we innovate on governance, what the role of government is in today's world that might not be anchored to legacy thinking or legacy problems that governments of yesterday were designed to solve. And so I think that there is real technological opportunity. There's real social opportunity. There's a massive mountain to climb, right? I mean, this is not I make it clear in the paper, this is not an easy path. There's huge hurdles that you have, but the promise is so incredibly compelling in terms of what could be, that it feels to me like it has to be given the proper treatment.
I'm not sure how many listeners or readers Impact Alpha has inside Iran, but I imagine one of the audiences for your paper and for your message is the diaspora, which is quite significant and quite actually, let's say, well-heeled and well-educated and prepped and motivated. So how do you see this diaspora opportunity playing out?
Yeah, I mean, the Iranian diaspora is singular in scope and size. I think that there's a number of really interesting elements. I mean, all of us were either, remember or were raised by people that remember, what Iran was before the revolution. So the memory of Iran that was a symbol of progress, that was a symbol of technological progress and advancement and social progress. It's not just the Persian Empire, which also represented that, which Iranians are deeply, deeply anchored to, but it's also just the actual memory. I was born before this happened in the country where it happened, and so while I was a young child when I left, I see. I have pictures of me sitting in the lap of my aunt who's wearing a miniskirt, in the middle of the city. So there's this really proximity of memory, but there's also it's a uniquely educated and organized diaspora. The recent protests, you had a day where 1 million people went into the streets in a very organized way, and these are. As you mentioned, very highly educated, very well connected, very successful diaspora that are deeply, deeply and actively committed to the homeland. I think that there's some challenges too, right? The fraying of trust that the government has spent so much time doing definitely has its has its shadows, and its wake has definitely affected the diaspora community. But you have a uniquely motivated and a uniquely organized and a uniquely resourced diaspora, just from a sheer size alone. Let alone, it's a big country, right? As you mentioned, there's 93 million people in the country, and a significant diaspora really spread across the world.
And so even beyond the actual Iranian diaspora, you talked about impact investors. There is a danger, as you pointed out, to private capital seeking returns. There's a model for that that's more extractive and exploitive. There's also a model where the capital is aligned, as you said, with this relational imperative, and where it supports communities on the ground, and it finds its way to the right people. So what is the role for impact investors?
Yeah, the impact is huge, honestly, for impact investors. We worked really closely with UNDP, the president's office in Zambia, and the head of the SEC in Zambia about a year ago. There was an energy crisis that led to a food crisis, and we worked on designing a new financial instrument to be able to capitalize solving the energy problem that also will solve the food problem. And the chain was, hey, make the problem big enough so that we can actually structure the right type of a capital instrument that's not that you, and you can't just build a renewable energy storage unless you actually have an offtake. And so you need to think about who's offtaking it. But if you have a refrigerated EV company that's going to buy it, that can then transport food from the farmers to the thing, and in doing so, significantly reduce the 60% post-harvest loss that the farmers are facing, you just unlocked a bunch of cash for the farmers, and some of which can pay for the electric vehicles with refrigeration, some of which will then pay for the power, and all of a sudden you have an offtake. And so this is the situation where 96% of the patents of Iranian born generated patents, are filed outside of Iran. The brain drain is widely cited to be about $50 billion a year, which in a good year equals the oil exports of Iran. So like in many years, the brain drain is actually more expensive than the than the revenues generated from the oil in the ground. So if you can think about, hey, if we can capture, there's value to be captured over here, which means there's significant economic upside if Iran transitions from the regime that it currently is, which represses so much value inside and outside the country, to one that generates value. Like the economic story is so much greater that clearly there's a financial return to be made. If the only consideration is a financial return, however, then you're never going to get the upside that a transition to a healthy society is ultimately going to give you. But if you transition to the healthy upside, where we have the women participating in there, we have the Baluchis, the Kurds, the Arabs in Khuzestan, the Baha'is, where you all have all of these communities that have been, actively sort of suppressed, participate in the development of an economy. Boy, your economic upside is going to be greater, your social upside is going to be greater, and guess what social upside gives you? It ensures the economic upside of tomorrow. And the ability to be able to think not just in terms of financial return when you're thinking about return, but think more expansively about return, which includes financial return. If that doesn't happen, then you're going to end up with an idea for $300 billion of private sector capital to go into a broken system, which, we know how that story ends.
Todd, that's as powerful a rendition of what we think of as the impact alpha thesis as I've heard. If you don't deliver the impact or optimize for the impact, you're not going to get that alpha. And I'm taken also by the fact that we started this conversation with the very profound and personal reflections and the pain of the current situation, but now you are as excited as I've seen you about the possibilities, and that's what we love about you is how passionate you get about the upside. And again, the piece that you had for Impact Alpha ends in part by saying what is good for people and the environment is good for the economy. They are not separate ledgers to be reconciled. They are the same ledger observed at different timescales. That is the premise of systemic investing, and Iran's reconstruction may prove its largest available case. So I know that you are going to be in demand for this kind of thinking, again, whether it's 5 months or 5 years. Iran needs your thinking. Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast, and we're going to be tracking along right with you.
Thanks so much for having me, David. So it's wonderful to reconnect with you and to have a chance to have a conversation about something that's deeply near and dear to my heart.
That's going to do it for this Agents of Impact podcast. Big thanks to Todd, to our producer Isaac Silk, to the whole team at Impact Alpha, and to all of you Agents of Impact, with deep gratitude for all that you do.